A 6-year-old girl was attacked by robbers in a dark alley. They wanted to steal not only her medicine, but also her wheelchair. When all seemed lost, a cold and powerful millionaire stepped out of his luxury car. What he discovered about the past would forever change their destinies. Subscribe to the channel to receive heartwarming stories every day. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of the penthouse, creating golden patterns on the Italian marble floor. The millionaire adjusted the knot of his silk tie in front of the Venetian mirror, his grey eyes reflecting a coldness that decades of business had sculpted onto his face. At 52, he had built a real estate empire spanning 3 states, but his personal life had been an emotional desert since he lost his wife in an accident 15 years ago. His morning routine always followed the same meticulous ritual: Colombian coffee prepared by the silent housekeeper, reading financial reports while the driver warmed up the black Mercedes, and the commute to the office where dozens of employees greeted him with reverence mixed with fear. He liked that distance. Respect based on terror was more reliable than any form of affection. On the other side of the city, in a tenement where peeling walls told stories of decades of neglect, a 6-year-old girl awoke in her narrow bed. Her legs, immobile since the accident that had left her paraplegic 2 years earlier, were covered by a patched blanket that her grandmother had sewn from scraps of old clothes. The tiny room smelled of medicine and damp, but the child's eyes shone with a light that even adversity had not managed to extinguish. The grandmother, a 73-year-old woman whose hands trembled due to early Parkinson's, prepared the morning oatmeal on the gas stove that only worked on 2 burners. Her white hair was tied in a simple bun, and her face, marked by the wrinkles of time, carried the serenity of someone who had learned to find beauty in small, everyday miracles. "Grandma, today is the doctor's appointment," the girl said, rising. In bed, with the agility she had developed in her arms to compensate for the paralysis of her legs. Her voice carried a maturity strange for her age, forged by the circumstances that had forced her to grow up faster than other children. The grandmother felt a familiar stab in her head, the harbinger of one of the migraines that tormented her with increasing frequency. "My little one, Grandma is feeling a little weak today. Maybe we can reschedule." "No, Grandma. The doctor said I can't miss it. The medicine is running out, and without it my legs will get even stiffer." The girl spoke with a determination that broke the grandmother's heart. She knew her granddaughter was right. The physiotherapy and medication were essential to prevent muscle atrophy from progressing even faster. Meanwhile, in the millionaire's panoramic office, an entire wall of glass offered a privileged view of the city. He could see the affluent neighborhoods with their well-kept trees, and in the distance, the slums that spread like scars on the urban landscape. For years, he had observed this division with the indifference of someone who had become accustomed to living only on his side of the invisible line that separated the worlds. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was the director of an NGO asking for donations for underprivileged children. "Sir, with just a small contribution, you could change the life of—" "I'm not interested," he cut off dryly, hanging up the phone. For him, poverty was the result of bad choices and lack of competence. He didn't understand why he should be responsible for other people's problems when he had built his fortune with his own sweat and intelligence. In the tenement, the girl insisted on going to the appointment, alone. "Grandma, I know the way. The little chair is working well, and I'll be careful with the potholes in the street." Her arms, strengthened by months of exclusive reliance on them for locomotion, spun the wheels of the chair with surprising skill. The grandmother hesitated, torn between the growing pain in her head and the concern for her granddaughter. "You're too young to go alone, my love. The street is dangerous, and you—" "I'm not little anymore, Grandma. I know how to take care of myself." The girl approached her grandmother and held her trembling hand firmly. "The medicine money is in the backpack. I know exactly where the clinic is, and I'll be right back home. I promise." Tears formed in the grandmother's tired eyes. She knew that her granddaughter needed to develop independence, but the world outside seemed increasingly hostile to a child in such a vulnerable situation. Even so, love sometimes demanded courage to let go. The morning was particularly hot when the girl left the tenement, navigating her wheelchair through the potholed streets. With the determination of an experienced sailor, the weight of the backpack on her back reminded her of the responsibility she carried. Inside was the money for the medicine, saved penny by penny for weeks by her grandmother. The broken sidewalks and open manholes turned each block into a challenge. Other children in the neighborhood sometimes helped her overcome the bigger obstacles. But that day, the street was strangely empty. The heat made most people seek the shade of their homes, leaving the streets deserted under the scorching sun. At the clinic, the appointment went as always. Routine checkups, adjustments to medication, and the doctor's recommendations on exercises she should do at home. The doctor, a kind man who worked at the public clinic out of vocation, always reserved words of encouragement for her. "You're growing strong, little warrior," he said, handing her the prescription for the medications. "Keep it up, and soon you'll be doing things you never thought possible." The girl smiled, carefully putting the papers in her backpack. At the pharmacy next door, she exchanged the money for the medicine, checking each box as her grandmother had taught her. Everything was correct. Now all she had to do was go home and show Grandma that she had managed to fulfill the mission alone. On the other side of the city, the millionaire was leaving a particularly tense meeting with foreign investors. The deal was closed. Another luxury residential complex would be built in an area that until recently housed low-income families. He didn't think about the people who had been relocated. For him, that was just a matter of numbers and land optimization. "Home," he ordered the driver, a discreet man who had worked for him for over 10 years. The black Mercedes glided through, the streets like a silent shadow, the dark windows preventing anyone outside from seeing who was inside the vehicle. The usual route passed through the central districts, but that day there was a blockage on the main avenue due to construction. The driver suggested a detour through the outlying neighborhoods, a road they rarely used. "Whatever," the millionaire replied, engrossed in reading reports on his tablet. "Take the fastest route." The girl had decided to return by a shortcut she knew well, an alley that cut through 2 blocks and would take her home faster. It was a narrow passage between 2 abandoned buildings, known to the locals as a dangerous place, but usually quiet during the day. She was halfway through the alley when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw 2 men approaching, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel a chill in her stomach. She tried to speed up the chair, but her small hands couldn't generate enough speed. Well, what do we have here?" said one of the men, a skinny guy with teeth yellowed by cigarettes. "A rich girl taking a stroll all alone." "Rich?" laughed the other, taller and with a scar on his face. "Look at that old chair. But there must be something valuable in the backpack." The girl felt the world spin around her. Her hands trembled on the wheels of the chair, and she could hear her own heart beating violently in her chest. "Please don't hurt me. I'm just going home." The black Mercedes slowly entered the alley, the driver trying to navigate the loose stones and potholes. The millionaire raised his eyes from the tablet, annoyed by the slowness of the journey, when the scene unfolded before his eyes like a slow-motion movie. A girl in a wheelchair was cornered by 2 men who were gesturing threateningly. She was crying and trying to get away, but the walls of the alley limited her escape options. It was a scene that should have only prompted a mental note about the need for more policing in the area. But something different happened. For an instant that lasted an eternity, the millionaire's eyes met the girl's through the car window. In that childish gaze, he saw a pure fear and a vulnerability that touched something deep within his long dormant soul. It was as if a fissure had opened in the wall he had built around his heart. "Stop the car," he ordered, his voice sounding strange even to himself. The driver hesitated. "Sir, maybe it's better." I said, "Stop the car. Now." The Mercedes stopped with a soft squeal of brakes, and for a few seconds the millionaire remained, motionless in the leather seat, watching the scene through the dark glass. His rational mind screamed alerts. That wasn't his problem. It could be dangerous. He had important commitments waiting. But something deeper prevented him from ordering the driver to move on. "Sir," the driver said, turning with concern. "Should we call the police and—" "No." The word came out firmer than he expected. The millionaire opened the car door with a determined movement, stepping out into the stifling heat of the alley. His Italian shoes touched the uneven asphalt, and for the first time in years he found himself on the same level as the street he had always observed from above. The two assailants had snatched the girl's backpack and were now examining its contents, with disappointment. "There's just old medicine here," complained the taller one. "But this chair, we can sell it, right?" "No!" the girl cried, her small hands clutching desperately at the arms of the chair. "Please, I need it. I can't walk." The skinnier man laughed cruelly. "That's not our problem, girl. You'll have to fend for yourself." It was at that moment that the millionaire's voice echoed through the narrow alley, charged with an authority that made both criminals turn instantly. "Get away from the child, now!" The contrast was shocking. A man impeccably dressed, emanating power and wealth, confronting two thugs in a foul-smelling alley. The attackers looked at each other, quickly calculating their options. That man clearly had money, but he also seemed to have the kind of influence that could cause them serious trouble. "Listen here, boss," began the taller one, trying to maintain bravado. "This is none of your business. You better get back in your fancy car and—" I said to get away. The millionaire's voice dropped an octave, becoming dangerously calm. I won't repeat myself. There was something in his posture, in the way his grey eyes fixed on them without blinking, that communicated more threat than any shout could. The two men looked at each other again, and without another word, ran off through the other side of the alley, leaving the girl's backpack behind. The silence that followed was broken only by the child's muffled sobs. The millionaire stood still, for a moment, watching her. Tears were running down her dirty face, and she was trembling so much that she could barely hold the wheels of the chair. Part of him wanted to simply go back to the car and continue his life, pretend that none of that had happened, but he couldn't. He approached slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice sounding strangely gentle. The girl looked up at him, still frightened. "No, sir. They didn't hit me, but they took my backpack." The millionaire picked up the backpack from the ground and handed it to her. He saw her small hands trembling as she received it, anxiously, checking if the medicine was still inside. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you very much." He should have left at that moment. He should have gone back to the car, maybe left some money and resumed his orderly life. But when he looked at that childish face, still wet with tears, something inside him refused to leave. "Where do you live?" he heard himself asking. The girl hesitated, clearly taught by her grandmother not to talk to strangers. But something in the unexpected kindness of that man made her answer. "Nearby, sir, in the tenement on Flower Street." The millionaire knew Flower Street. It was one of the areas that his office had mapped for future gentrification projects. A region of tenements and precarious houses that, according to his architects, had potential for appreciation after urban renewal. He had never thought that real people with real lives inhabited those numbers on his spreadsheets. "You came all the way here alone?" he asked, incredulous. "Grandma was sick, but I know how to take care of myself." There was pride in her voice. mixed with the fear still present. I always go places alone. The man who for decades had built his fortune based on cold and calculated decisions found himself facing an emotional dilemma. His rational mind listed all the reasons not to get involved. He didn't know that child, didn't have time for social problems. His schedule was packed. But when she tried to maneuver the chair to get out of the alley and one of the wheels got stuck in a pothole, he found himself automatically stooping to help her. "Let me take you home," he said, and the words came out before he could think about them. The girl looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "You don't have to. I can manage." "I know you can," he replied, surprising himself with his own patience. "But it doesn't hurt to accept a little help." For the first time in 15 years, since the death of his wife, the millionaire was about to voluntarily enter the life of another person. The journey to the tenement was made in a silence charged with tension. The girl was sitting in the back seat of the Mercedes, her wheelchair folded in the trunk, looking with wide eyes at the luxurious interior of the vehicle. The soft leather, the chrome details, the silent air conditioning, all that was more sophisticated than any place she had ever been. The millionaire watched her in the rearview mirror, noticing how she carefully touched the fabric of the seat, as if afraid of getting it dirty. There was a delicacy in her movements that contrasted with the determination she had shown in confronting the attackers. "What's your name?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Grandma calls me Flower Girl," she replied, shyly, "because of the street where we live." The driver, following the girl's instructions, drove through the narrow streets that became progressively more precarious. The millionaire watched through the window, a world that existed a few miles from his penthouse, but that could be on another planet. Children played barefoot in the street, clothes dried on makeshift clotheslines between the windows, and the smell of cheap food mixed with the odor of open sewers. When they arrived on Flower Street, the contrast became even more striking. The black Mercedes stood out completely from the landscape of shacks and tenements, attracting curious and some wary glances from the residents. The girl seemed to notice the discomfort that her arrival in a luxury car might cause. "You can drop me off here on the corner," she said. "I can go home from here." But the millionaire had already gotten out of the car and was taking the wheelchair out of the trunk. There was something in his determination that did not admit of discussion. When he helped her transfer to the chair, he noticed how light she was. Too small for her 6 years, probably the result of inadequate nutrition. The tenement where she lived was an old building divided into several tiny rooms, with a shared bathroom at the end of the corridor. The peeling walls and the smell of dampness told the story of decades of neglect. The girl guided him through the narrow corridor to a wooden door painted faded blue. "Grandma, I'm home," she announced, lightly knocking on the door. The door opened, revealing an elderly woman with a worried face, who was immediately relieved to see her granddaughter, but was visibly confused by the presence of the elegantly dressed stranger next to her. "Flower Girl, thank God you're back. I was so worried." The grandmother stopped mid-sentence, her eyes going from her granddaughter to the millionaire. "Who is this gentleman? He saved me, Grandma. Some bad men tried to steal my backpack and my chair, but he arrived and they ran away." The grandmother paled, putting her hand to her heart. "My God, my little one, did you get hurt? What happened?" The millionaire watched the scene with a strange emotion growing in his chest. The grandmother's genuine concern, the way the girl nestled in her arms seeking comfort, the palpable love between the two, all that awakened memories that he had buried long ago. "The girl is fine," he said, his voice softer than he usually used. "But maybe we should talk about what happened." The grandmother invited him in, apologizing for the precariousness of the place. The room was small, with a single bed, a small table, 2 old chairs, and some improvised furniture. But it was impeccably clean and organized, with small details. that showed the care of someone who transforms a poor house into a loving home. While the grandmother prepared coffee on a portable stove, the millionaire noticed the photographs on the wall. Black and white images from past eras, some more recent showing the girl before the accident, others of a family he couldn't identify. "You were very kind to help my granddaughter," the grandmother said, serving the coffee in mismatched cups. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," he replied, accepting the cup. The coffee was strong and sweet, unlike the gourmet blend he was used to drinking. "Anyone would do the same," the grandmother smiled sadly. "You would be surprised at how many people go through situations like this and simply move on. We live in a world where people prefer not to get involved." The grandmother's words hit him like a punch in the stomach. How many times had he himself moved on? How many situations of need had he ignored, justifying his inaction with the belief that it wasn't his responsibility? "Tell me about yourselves," he said, surprising himself with the question. "How do you live here?" The grandmother hesitated, clearly not accustomed to sharing the intimate details of her life with strangers, especially with someone who obviously belonged to a completely different social class. But there was something in the man's genuine attention that encouraged her to speak. She told of the accident that had left her granddaughter paraplegic, of the increasing costs of the medications, of how her small pension barely covered the basic needs. She spoke of the girl's determination, of her precocious intelligence, of how she had learned to overcome every obstacle with a strength that left the grandmother simultaneously proud and heartbroken. The millionaire listened in silence, feeling a growing weight in his chest. For the first time, he was being confronted with the human consequences of the inequality he had always considered only an abstract economic reality. "She could have a bright future," the grandmother said, looking lovingly at the granddaughter who was playing quietly in the corner of the room. "But the opportunities are few for children like her in situations like ours." At that moment, the millionaire realized that he had entered a completely new territory where his certainties about the world were beginning to crumble. In the days that followed the encounter in the alley, the millionaire discovered something disturbing. He couldn't forget the girl and her grandmother. During important meetings, his mind wandered to that tiny room where two people found strength in mutual love. In the silence of his luxurious penthouse, the contrast between his golden solitude and the emotional richness of that humble family haunted him. Initially, he tried to rationalize his impulses. He had his assistant deliver an envelope with money to the tenement address, imagining that would solve his unease. But the gesture, however generous, only intensified his discomfort. It was like trying to heal a deep wound with a superficial bandage. A week after their first encounter, he found himself driving again through the streets of the periphery, this time alone, in a more discreet car. He told himself that he just wanted to check if they were okay, if the money had helped. But the truth was more complex. There was a growing need for connection that he didn't know how to name. He found the girl in the small common yard of the tenement, playing alone with some makeshift toys made of cardboard boxes. She had created an imaginary hospital where she took care of dolls made of rags, reproducing with surprising precision the medical procedures she knew from her own appointments. "Hello," he said, approaching carefully. She looked up and her face lit up with a genuine smile. "You're back, Grandma. The man who helped me is here." The grandmother appeared at the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes showed surprise mixed with a gratitude that made him feel simultaneously honored and unworthy. "I thought I'd see how you were doing," he explained, feeling strangely nervous. "If you need anything, you've already done so much," the grandmother replied. "The money you sent was a blessing. We were able to buy the medicine for 2 months." He nodded, but realized that it wasn't about money that he wanted to talk. He watched the girl resume her play, noticing how she had adapted each movement to function from her chair. There was something fascinating about her resilience, about how she transformed limitations into creativity. "May I ask about the accident?" he said hesitantly. The grandmother sighed, a veil of sadness passing over her eyes. She was 4 years old. "We were coming back from the market when a car at high speed lost control on our street. The driver was drunk. Her voice was controlled, but he could feel the pain still alive. She was in the hospital for 3 months. The doctors said it was a miracle she survived. And the driver? He had money, good lawyers. He was only in jail for a few months." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a weary resignation. "It's no use hating. That won't give my granddaughter back her legs." The millionaire felt a revolt growing in his chest. He knew how the justice system worked for the rich. He had benefited from it a few times in corporate disputes, but he had never thought about the victims on the other side of the scale. During the following weeks, his visits became regular. He always found an excuse to bring fruit, to check if they needed any repairs in the tenement, or simply to happen to be passing by the area. The girl began to look forward to his visits with increasing enthusiasm, showing him her drawings, telling him elaborate stories about her dolls, sharing with him a world of imagination that he had forgotten existed. The grandmother watched these encounters with a mixture of gratitude and caution. She knew that powerful men rarely took an interest in poor families without a reason, but there was something genuine in the way he interacted with her granddaughter. He never spoke with condescension, never showed pity. He treated the girl as a whole person with valid opinions and ideas. "Why don't you have children?" the girl asked one afternoon, with the frankness typical of children. The question caught him off guard. For a moment he considered giving an evasive answer, but something in her curious eyes made him be honest. "I had a son," he said slowly. "But he died when he was a baby, along with my wife." The girl was quiet for a moment, processing the information. With the seriousness that children reserve for important matters, "They must miss you," she said finally. The simplicity of her words touched a wound that he thought was healed. For the first time in 15 years, he spoke about his lost family, about how he had closed himself off to the world after the tragedy, about how he had chosen professional success as a shield against emotional pain. The grandmother listened in silence, recognizing a familiar pain in his story. They had both lost loved ones. They had both found different ways to survive the loss. "The pain never completely goes away," she said gently. "But sometimes, if we let it, it can turn into something different, into caring for other people." That afternoon, as he was returning home, the millionaire understood that something fundamental had changed inside him. The girl and her grandmother were no longer a charity project or a sociological curiosity. They had become important to him in a way that he couldn't explain or control, but that discovery brought with it new fears. Getting emotionally involved meant the risk of new loss, new pain. And there were practical aspects to consider: his social standing, his corporate responsibilities, what other people would think. It would be in the next chapter that a discovery would change everything between them, revealing connections that fate had woven long before that encounter in the dark alley. It was during a particularly hot afternoon that the grandmother, with her hands trembling more than usual due to Parkinson's, decided to show the millionaire some old photographs. She had realized how genuinely interested he was in their stories, and there was something about his presence that aroused in her a strange sense of familiarity. "You like hearing about our past so much," she said, pulling a yellowed shoebox from under the bed. "Maybe you'd like to see some memories." The millionaire helped her to sit in the most comfortable chair in the room while she carefully opened the box. Inside was a treasure trove of memories, Black and white photographs, some faded color photographs, yellowed letters, and small objects that clearly had sentimental value. "I worked in many homes throughout my life," she began, leafing through the photos with affection. "But there was a family, a very special family to me." She showed a photograph where she appeared younger, wearing an impeccable white uniform, holding a baby in her arms, while an elegant woman smiled beside her. The woman in the photo had carefully styled brown hair and was wearing a dress that, even in black and white, was obviously expensive. "I worked as a nanny in this house for almost 3 years, the grandmother continued, her voice filled with nostalgia. "It was a wonderful family. The lady of the house was kind. She treated all the employees with respect. And the baby..." She smiled, gently touching the photo. "This baby was like my own son." The millionaire observed the photograph with growing interest. There was something familiar about the photo's position, the quality of the paper, the way the people were arranged. But it was when the grandmother turned the photo over and he read what was written on the back that his world completely stopped. "The Mansfield family, 1975. Mrs. Helen and little Michael. Mama Lourdes. Mama Lourdes." The name echoed in his mind like a distant bell, awakening memories he had kept in the deepest corners of his childhood. Michael. That was his baptismal name, before adopting only his last name for business. "Michael," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. The baby's name was Michael. "Yes," the grandmother replied, not noticing the transformation that was taking place on the face of the man in front of her. "A beautiful boy, very smart. He grew up strong and healthy. I breastfed him along with my own son, who was born at the same time." The millionaire's hands trembled as he picked up the photograph. There he was, a baby in the arms of the woman, who he now recognized with a shock of emotion that left him breathless. Mama Lourdes, the woman who had been more of a mother to him than his own biological mother, who was always busy with social engagements. "Lourdes," he said, his voice choked. "Your Lourdes." The grandmother stopped leafing through the photos and looked at him with surprise. "How do you know my name? I hadn't said..." He got up abruptly, walking to the small window of the room as if he needed air. His mind was working frantically, connecting dots he had ignored. The sense of familiarity he felt with the grandmother, the natural way he related to the girl, the strange comfort he found in that humble environment. "I am Michael," he said, turning to face her. "Michael August Mansfield. You were my nanny." The silence that followed was deafening. The grandmother dropped the photographs, her eyes filling with tears as she studied the face of the man in front of her. Slowly, as if she were seeing through decades of time, she began to recognize in the mature man the features of the baby she had cared for with so much love. "My God," she whispered, bringing her hands to her face. "My boy Michael. My boy." The girl, who had been playing quietly in the corner, sensed the tension in the air and approached the grandmother. "Grandma, what's happening? Why are you crying?" The millionaire knelt before Lourdes' chair, taking her wrinkled hands in his. "Mama Lourdes, I looked for you after my parents died, but you had disappeared. No one knew where you had gone. They sent me away," she said, the tears flowing freely down her face. "After your father passed away, the family thought I knew too much about the business. They said I was a risk. They gave me some money and sent me far away, with threats that something bad might happen if I tried to make contact." The rage he felt at that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the cold rage of business, but something visceral, protective. The woman who had been his source of love and care in childhood had been treated as disposable by the very family he later inherited. "They said you had resigned," he said, his voice filled with indignation. "They said you didn't want to work for us anymore. I would never have left you of my own free will, Lourdes replied, holding his face between her hands as she had done when he was a child. You were my boy. I loved you as if you were my own son. The girl watched the scene with wide eyes, trying to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Grandma, did you know the man when he was little? I took care of him since he was born, Lourdes explained, her voice still choked with emotion. He nursed at my breast along with your uncle. They were like milk brothers. My uncle? The girl asked, confused. Your father was my biological son. Lourdes explained to the millionaire. He was born a few days before you. I managed to raise the two of you together until... Her voice faltered. Until when? He asked gently. Until my son died at 5. Pneumonia that we couldn't treat in time. After that, you became even more special to me. It was as if I had lost a son, but I still had another to love. The millionaire felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The woman in front of him was not just someone who had worked in his house. She was the person who had raised him, who had loved him unconditionally during the first years of his life. And the girl in the wheelchair was not just a child he had saved from robbers. She was the granddaughter of the woman who had been his second mother. That means, he began, looking at the girl with new eyes. That means your family, said Lourdes, sobbing. Not by blood, but by love. You were my first son, and she is my second chance to be a mother and grandmother. The girl reached out her small hand to touch the millionaire's arm. So, you're kind of my big brother, she asked with the simplicity of children. He looked at that girl, his half-sibling by milk, granddaughter of the woman who had raised him, and felt something complete itself inside his chest. For 40 years, he had carried a void that he never knew how to name. Now he understood that it was the lack of the family that had been torn from him as a child. Yes, he said, his voice barely able to come out. I think I am. And at that moment, in the tiny room of a tenement on the periphery, 3 generations met again through the invisible thread of love that neither time nor distance had been able to break. The discovery had changed everything. It was no longer about charity or social guilt. It was about family. It was about coming home. The discovery of the true connection between them should have been the beginning of a new phase of happiness. But what followed was a storm of complications that none of them had foreseen. The millionaire, who now insisted that Lourdes call him Michael again, as in childhood, was determined to make up for the 40 years of forced separation. In the days following the revelation, he began to visit the tenement daily, bringing gifts, planning changes, talking about moving the grandmother and the girl to a better home. His euphoria was contagious, but also desperate, as if he wanted to erase decades of distance in a few weeks. Michael, Lourdes said one morning, using the tone she reserved for serious conversations, you need to be careful. This situation of ours, it could bring problems. He was on the floor playing with the girl, putting together a puzzle he had brought, when the grandmother spoke. He looked up, noticing the worry in her wrinkled face. What kind of problems? He asked, although deep down he already knew the answer. You are an important man, a powerful man. You have business, commitments, a reputation to protect. And we are poor, Michael, very poor. People will ask questions. They will create stories. As if her words were prophetic, the millionaire's phone rang at that exact moment. It was Richard, his majority partner and best friend since college, with a voice filled with concern. Michael, we need to talk. Urgent. An hour later, in the panoramic office that had become his fortress against the world, the millionaire faced an impromptu war council. Richard was there, along with Helen, the company's director of public relations, and Dr. Carter, the corporate lawyer who had been taking care of his interests for over a decade. The photos are already circulating on social media, Helen said, showing him a tablet with images of him entering and leaving the tenement. Someone recognized you and started speculating. There are rumors of everything, from you having a poor mistress to stories about illegitimate children. That's ridiculous, he replied, but his voice didn't carry the usual conviction. Ridiculous or not, it's affecting our business, Richard interjected. The investors in the residential project are nervous. You know how it is. They want partners who represent stability and status. A millionaire who frequents tenements raises questions about judgment and priorities. Dr. Carter leaned forward, assuming the professional tone he used for delicate matters. Michael, legally speaking, any formal association with this family can create dangerous precedents. If you acknowledge family ties, even if effective, there may be issues of inheritance, legal responsibility, even blackmail in the future. Blackmail? The millionaire exploded. We're talking about the woman who raised me and a 6-year-old child with a disability. We're talking about people who may have an interest in your fortune, the lawyer retorted coldly. You disappeared. For weeks, you are emotionally involved, making impulsive decisions. From a legal point of view, this puts you in a vulnerable position. Helen opened another file on the tablet. Look at what they're writing on the gossip blogs. Real estate millionaire allegedly has secret relationship with needy family. This will escalate quickly if we don't control the narrative. The millionaire got up and walked to the window, looking at the city that stretched out at his feet. Down below, somewhere he couldn't see from there, were Lords and the girl, probably not imagining the storm that was brewing around them. What are you suggesting? He asked without turning around. Gradual distancing, Richard replied. You help financially in a discreet way, but stop showing up there. Let things cool down. Eventually people forget. And if I don't want to distance myself? The silence that followed was eloquent. Helen was the first to speak, her professional voice barely masking the discomfort. Michael, you've built an empire. You have responsibilities to hundreds of employees, commitments to investors, projects that move millions. You can help this family without compromising all that, but you need to be strategic. Strategic, he repeated bitterly. Just like it was strategic when my own family distanced Lords from me when I was a child. Dr. Carter cleared his throat. Actually, Michael, I did some research on this after you mentioned it. Your parents had legitimate reasons for concern. There were security issues at the time, attempts to kidnap wealthy heirs. Maintaining distance from employees who knew intimate details of the family was a necessary precaution. Necessary precaution, the millionaire murmured, feeling a familiar pain in his chest. There's always a rational justification for abandoning those we love, isn't there? At that moment, his personal phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer. Hello? Michael? Lords's voice was strange, scared. Can you come here? There are some men here asking questions about you, about our family. They're scaring my granddaughter. The millionaire's blood ran cold. What kind of men? They say they're journalists. They want to know how long we've known each other, if you give us money, if you're the girl's father. Her voice broke on the last sentence. The millionaire looked at the people in the office, who had obviously heard at least part of the conversation. Richard shook his head discreetly, while Helen was already typing something on the phone, probably. For the damage control team, Lords, lock the door and don't talk to anyone. I'm on my way. Michael, no, Richard said as soon as he hung up. If you show up there now, you'll confirm all the speculation. It will be a media circus. And if I don't show up, I'll once again abandon the people I love most in life. Dr. Carter stood up, assuming an almost paternal tone. Michael, you are being emotional. That's understandable, but it's not productive. There are ways to protect this family without exposing yourself publicly. We can hire discreet security, move them to a new address, even provide a new identity if necessary. New identity, the millionaire repeated slowly. You want me to hide my family as if it were a shameful secret. We want you to protect your interests and theirs, Helen corrected. Immediate exposure will not benefit anyone. Imagine what it will be like for a disabled child to be pursued by photographers, to have her privacy invaded, to be called a gold digger at the age of 6. The image that Helen painted hit him like a punch in the stomach. The girl, who already faced so many challenges, didn't deserve to be turned into a spectacle for tabloids, hungry for scandal. But at the same time, the idea of abandoning Lourdes and the girl again, even for noble reasons, seemed like an unbearable betrayal to the man he was becoming after finding them. I need time to think, he said finally. Time is exactly what we don't have, Helen replied. With every hour that passes, this story grows. We need a decision now. The millionaire looked once more out the window, divided between two worlds that seemed irreconcilable. The empire he had built and the family he had lost and found. For the first time in decades, he faced a decision that money and power couldn't simply solve. Across town, in the tiny room of the tenement, Lourdes held her frightened granddaughter in her arms, while insistent voices outside the door demanded answers that she didn't know how to give. Fate had brought a family together, but the world seemed determined to separate them again. Night had fallen over the city when the millionaire finally made his decision. He spent hours walking the empty streets around his building, ignoring the insistent calls from Richard and Helen, trying to find clarity in the whirlwind of emotions that had become his life. It was during this solitary walk that a forgotten memory resurfaced with devastating force. He was 7 years old and had fallen ill with a high fever that lasted for days. His parents were traveling on business, and it was Lourdes who spent sleepless nights taking care of him, putting wet cloths on his forehead, singing lullabies to calm him when the fever nightmares tormented him. Mama Lourdes will always take care of you, my boy, she whispered in the dark. No matter what happens, you'll always have a place in my heart. Now, 45 years later, he was the one who had the power to take care of her. And this responsibility, he realized, was not a burden. It was a privilege that he had unconsciously sought throughout his adult life. When he got home, he found more than 20 messages on his answering machine. Journalists, social columnists, even some opportunistic blackmailers who had discovered the story and wanted to negotiate. He deleted them all without listening to the end. Instead, he made a call to someone he hadn't sought out in years, Charlie, a respected investigative journalist who'd been a college classmate and who had always remained upright despite the pressures of the media market. Charlie? It's Michael Mansfield. I need your help. 3 hours later, Charlie was at his penthouse, listening attentively as the millionaire told the whole story, from the encounter in the alley to the discovery of Lourdes' true identity. When he finished, Charlie remained silent for a long moment. It's an incredible story, he finally said, but are you sure you want to make this public? Once it's out there, there's no going back. I'm tired of hiding who I really am, the millionaire replied. I spent 40 years building an image of a cold and calculating businessman because I thought it would protect me from the pain. But it didn't protect me from anything. It only isolated me from the people who could make me happy. Charlie nodded, recognizing the sincerity in his words. It will be a scandal initially, you know that. Your partners won't like it. Some business may be harmed. So be it. I can earn money again. Family can't be bought, Charlie, and I've already lost mine once. I won't lose it again. That same morning, the millionaire drove to the tenement. He found a police car parked at the entrance. Lourdes had called the authorities when the journalists became more aggressive. 2 police officers were standing guard to keep the curious away. I'm Michael Mansfield, he told the sergeant in charge. They are my family. The police officer recognized him immediately. There weren't many people in the city who didn't know, at least by sight, one of the richest men in the country. Mr. Mansfield, the situation is under control now, but it was chaos earlier. Dozens of people trying to get in, photographers, reporters. Can I see them? Of course, sir. They're fine, just scared. When he entered the room, he found Lourdes sitting on the bed holding her granddaughter, who was sleeping restlessly in her arms. The grandmother's eyes were red from crying, and she seemed to have aged years in a single day. "Michael," she whispered, "what is all this mess? Why do these people want to hurt us?" He knelt beside the bed, as he had done as a child whenever he needed comfort. "It's not about hurting you, Mama Lourdes. It's about me, about us. The world out there doesn't understand that love can exist between people of different classes. Maybe it's better if you stay away," she said, her voice filled with deep sadness. "I don't want your life to be harmed because of us. My life only has meaning because of you," he replied, taking her hand, "and I'm never going to stay away again. But I need you to trust me to fix this the right way." The girl stirred in her, grandmother's arms slowly opening her eyes. When she saw the millionaire, a weak smile lit up her tired face. "You came," she murmured. "I knew you would come." "I will always come when you need it," he promised. "But now I need to tell you something important." He explained his plan. The next day, he would give an exclusive interview to Charlie, telling the whole truth about his story with Lourdes. It wouldn't be a sensationalist scandal, but an honest narrative about love, family, and second chances. "It will be difficult at first," he admitted. "People will talk, judge, make up stories, but eventually the truth will prevail. And when that happens, we will be together as a family without needing to hide." Lourdes shook her head, worried. "Michael, you don't understand. People like us, we don't live in the same world as you. We don't know how to deal with cameras, interviews, public attention." "Then you'll learn. And I'll teach you, just as you taught me everything I know about love and care." He spent the rest of the morning at the tenement, helping to calm the girl when she woke up scared by nightmares, talking quietly with Lourdes about the old days, planning a future that they could finally build together. When the sun rose, a decision had been made. He would no longer be the man who chose power over love. He would simply be Michael, the boy who had grown up in the arms of Mama Lourdes and who now had the chance to repay all the affection he had received. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in decades, he wasn't facing it alone. Outside, photographers were already beginning to gather again, sensing that something important was about to happen. They didn't know that they were about to witness not only a story of public interest, but a lesson about what really matters in life. The millionaire looked out the small window of the tenement, seeing the world outside preparing to judge him. But next to him, a child was sleeping peacefully in the arms of a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for others. And that, he decided, was worth any price he had to pay. The interview was scheduled for later that afternoon at Charlie's office, far from the curious eyes and opportunistic cameras that had multiplied around the tenement. The millionaire had taken every precaution. He had hired discreet security to protect Lourdes and the girl, had arranged a safe place for them to stay during the recording, and had asked Charlie to conduct the conversation in a respectful and humane way. But before the interview, he had one last battle to face. Richard, Helen, and Dr. Carter had obtained a court order to prevent the disclosure of the story, alleging that it could harm the company's business and the interests of the shareholders. The millionaire needed to be in court at 2 in the afternoon to defend his right to tell his own story. "Your Honor," Dr. Carter said to the judge, "my client is going through a moment of emotional instability. His recent decisions demonstrate a lack of judgment that can cause irreparable harm not only to him, but to hundreds of employees and investors who depend on the strength of his reputation." The judge, A middle-aged man with a serious look listened intently. The room was packed with lawyers, journalists, and curious onlookers who had managed to get permission to attend the hearing. "Your Honor," replied the lawyer, the millionaire, had hired specifically for that case. "There is no law that prevents a citizen from telling his own story. My client is an adult man in full use of his mental faculties and has the constitutional right to freedom of speech." When it was his turn to speak, the millionaire stood up and addressed the judge with a tranquility that surprised everyone. "Present! Your Honor, for 40 years of my life I made decisions based exclusively on financial and strategic criteria. I built a considerable fortune, but I lost what was most important, my humanity. A few weeks ago, fate gave me a second chance by making me reunite with the woman who raised me and her granddaughter, who is practically my sister in my heart." He paused, looking directly at Richard, who was in the front row, with an expression of disbelief. "My partners argue that revealing this story could harm our business. They are right. Some investors may get scared, some contracts may be cancelled. But I discovered something that no financial spreadsheet can measure: the value of a family." His voice became firmer, more passionate. "I am not just a CEO, Your Honor. I am a human being. And as a human being, I have the right to choose what kind of person I want to be. I can continue to be the cold man who puts profits above all else, or I can be the man who honors his origins and takes care of those who took care of him." The judge remained silent for a long moment, studying the millionaire with interest. Finally, he banged the gavel. "Denied the injunction. The plaintiff has the right to tell his story as long as it does not violate the privacy of third parties or disclose information proven to be false. Next case." 2 hours later, the millionaire was sitting in front of Charlie in a small makeshift studio with a single camera, recording what would become one of the most watched interviews of the year. "Michael," Charlie began, "you are known in the business world as a pragmatic man, focused exclusively on results. What happened that made you make such a human decision?" The millionaire took a deep breath, knowing that every word would be analyzed, dissected, interpreted in 1,000 different ways. But for the first time in decades, he didn't care about the consequences. "Charlie, I lived in a gilded cage. I had everything that money could buy, but I had lost the ability to feel true joy. When I found that girl being attacked in the alley, something within me awakened. It wasn't pity or a sense of justice. It was recognition, as if I were looking at myself as a child, vulnerable and in need of protection." And the discovery about Lourdes. Lourdes was more of a mother to me than my own biological mother. She breastfed me. She cradled me when I had nightmares. She taught me the first words. When my family distanced her from me, they tore a part of my soul. For 40 years, I tried to fill that void with professional success, but it was like trying to heal a wound with money. The interview lasted 2 hours. The millionaire spoke about his privileged but emotionally empty childhood, about the pain of losing Lourdes, about how he had become cold and calculating as a defense mechanism. He spoke about the reunion, about the courageous girl who made him rediscover the ability to love, about the decision to publicly embrace his family of the heart. "Some people will say you're being manipulated," said Charlie, "that a poor woman and her granddaughter are taking advantage of your feelings." "Let them say," the millionaire replied without hesitation. "Those who know Lourdes know that she would rather starve to death than accept a penny she didn't deserve. And as for the girl, she's 6 years old, Charlie. What kind of manipulation could a 6-year-old child exert? The only thing she did was show me that there was still goodness in the world." "And your business? Your partners have already expressed concern. My business survived 40 years without a soul. Maybe it's time to find out how they work with it." When the interview ended, The millionaire went straight to the tenement. He found an even bigger crowd than in the morning. Journalists, curious onlookers, neighbors, all wanting a glimpse of the story that was taking social media by storm. But something had changed in the environment. Instead of the surly hostility of the scandal seekers, there was an atmosphere of respect, almost reverence. The story told by him had humanized the situation, transforming what could have been a media circus into something deeper. He managed to get to the room where Lourdes and the girl were waiting, protected by the police officers who had remained on duty. "How was it?" Lourdes asked anxiously. "I told the truth, all of it." The girl was more excited than in the morning, apparently less affected by the confusion than the adults. "The people out there are talking about you," she said. "I heard a girl saying that you're a hero." "I'm not a hero, Flower Girl. I'm just a man who took a long time to understand what really matters in life." That night, as the interview was edited to be aired the next day, the millionaire made a series of decisions that would forever change the course of their lives. First, he bought a spacious house in a middle-class neighborhood, far from both the ostentation of his penthouse and the precariousness of the tenement. A place where Lourdes could have a garden, where the girl could play safely, where they could be a family without attracting excessive attention. Second, he restructured his company, transferring most of his shares to an ethical investment fund that prioritized social projects. He retained only enough participation to continue making strategic decisions, but freed himself from the pressure to maximize profits at all costs. Third, and most importantly, he established a permanent fund for children with disabilities in situations of social vulnerability. The fund would be administered by Lourdes, who, despite her age and lack of formal education, had an intuitive understanding of the real needs of needy families. "Mama Lourdes," he said as he explained the plans, "you have spent your life caring for children. Now you will have the resources to care for hundreds of them." The tears in the old lady's eyes said everything that words couldn't express. When the interview aired, it had an impact that no one had foreseen. Instead of a scandal, it generated a wave of empathy and reflection. People from all social classes identified with the story of a man who had lost his humanity in search of success and rediscovered it through love. The shares of his companies, which his partners feared would plummet, actually increased in value. Socially conscious investors saw in the millionaire's new stance an opportunity to bet on businesses with purpose. Contracts that seemed lost were renewed by companies that wanted to associate themselves with the image of social responsibility that he now represented. But the true measure of the decision's success came 3 days later, when he arrived at the new house and found Lourdes teaching the girl how to cook in the spacious kitchen while she told stories about her childhood. "Michael!" the girl shouted when she saw him, abandoning the dough she was kneading to run to him in her wheelchair. "Grandma is teaching me to make the bread she used to make for you when you were little." He knelt to receive the child's tight hug, smelling the flour and yeast that instantly transported him to his first years of life. "Do you remember the recipe?" he asked Lourdes. "A man never forgets the smell of the bread his mother made for him," she replied, smiling. "And you will always be my boy, no matter how old you are or how much money you make." That night, the three of them dined together for the first time as a publicly recognized family. The table wasn't marble like in his penthouse, nor was it makeshift like in the tenement. It was simply a table where people who loved each other shared a meal, and the millionaire discovered that this was exactly the kind of wealth he had spent his life looking for without knowing. 2 years had passed since that transformative afternoon in the courtroom, and life had found a completely new rhythm for the reconstituted family. The house that the millionaire had bought had become much more than a simple residence. It was a real home, filled with the sounds that had been missing in his solitary existence, laughter echoing through the corridors, lively conversations in the garden, the clinking of pans in the kitchen, where lords insisted on preparing meals, as in the old days. Michael had discovered routines that he never imagined valuing. Waking up early to accompany Isabella, the name by which the girl now liked to be called, to the special school where she studied, with physical therapists and equipment that were significantly accelerating her motor recovery. Having lunch at home whenever possible, listening to Lourdes tell stories of her youth that he never tired of hearing. Spending the afternoons helping Isabella with her homework, marveling at the brilliant intelligence that adversity had sharpened. Like a blade, the transformation was not limited to personal life. His business had taken a completely new direction. The fund he had established for children with disabilities had already benefited more than 500 families, providing not only medical assistance, but also equipment, residential adaptations, and above all, hope. Each case that he personally followed taught him something new about resilience, about the human capacity to find joy even in the most difficult circumstances. Lourdes, despite her age and the limitations imposed by the progressively advancing Parkinson's, had become a surprisingly effective administrator. Her life experience and her ability to identify real needs made every dollar invested much more efficient than any bureaucratic government program. She had become the soul of the project, the person who truly understood what it meant to fight for a dignified life. "Michael," she said one Sunday morning as they reviewed the fund's reports together in the flowered garden she had created, "there's a family here that reminds me a lot of us. An 8-year-old boy who lost his sight in an accident, and the mother, who works 3 jobs to pay for the treatment. What do you think we should do? I think you should meet them personally. Sometimes what people need most isn't money. It's someone who understands what they're going through." This had become a sacred routine. Michael personally visited the families benefited by the fund, not as a distant benefactor, but as someone who intimately understood the challenges of dealing with disability and precariousness. Each visit taught him something new, each story connected him more deeply with the purpose he had found. Isabella, who had now turned 9, had become his greatest teacher and source of inspiration. Her physical recovery was remarkable. She was already able to stand for short periods and take a few steps with the help of devices. More importantly, her brilliant personality and unwavering determination reminded Michael daily of what it truly meant to live fully. "Uncle Michael," she said one afternoon while they were doing physiotherapy together in the adapted pool he had built in the backyard, "why did it take you so long to find us?" The question, asked with the frankness typical of children, no longer caught him off guard, as it had in the early days. He had learned to talk to her about deep topics, respecting her intelligence and precocious maturity. "I was lost, flower girl. Sometimes when people grow up, they forget how to be happy. You reminded me. And now you're not going to get lost anymore. Now I have you to guide me for the rest of my life." Isabella smiled, pleased with the answer, and went back to focusing on her exercises in the water. The doctors said she could regain up to 70% of her mobility if she continued with intensive physical therapy. But Michael had learned that the true measure of recovery wasn't in physical ability. It was in the ability to dream, and Isabella dreamed big. "When I grow up," she said, as she often did, "I'm going to work at our hospital and help other children like me." "Our hospital?" "The one you're going to build. Grandma told me about your plans." Michael smiled. Lourdes had indeed spoken about her most ambitious idea, to build a medical center specializing in children with disabilities, where state-of-the-art treatment would be offered free of charge to low-income families. It was a project that would consume a good part of his fortune, but that would give him a purpose that no commercial transaction had ever provided. "If you want to work there, I'll save the job of medical director for you," he promised, provoking. A crystalline laugh from the girl. "You really promise?" "I solemnly promise." That night, as had become sacred in their lives, the three of them dined together in the cozy kitchen. Lourdes had prepared Michael's favorite food, the same chicken stew she used to make for him as a child, with the exact seasoning that had remained untouched in his effective memory for decades. Isabella told about her day at school, enthusiastically describing the new exercises she had learned and the friends she was making with increasing ease. After dinner, while Michael helped Lourdes with the dishes and Isabella watched her favorite shows in the living room, the grandmother gently touched his arm, as she did when she wanted to have an important conversation. "Are you happy, my son?" The question was simple, but it carried decades of maternal concern. Michael dried his hands and turned to look at the woman who had raised him, lost and found again, observing how time had left its most evident marks, but also how her love remained unwavering. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," he replied with absolute honesty. "Your biological mother would be proud of the man you've become." "Do you really think so?" "I'm sure of it. She may not have known how to show it at the time, but she loved you. And you have honored that love by becoming someone who cares for others as she would have liked to have cared for you." Later that night, after Isabella had gone to sleep and Lourdes had retired to her room, Michael went out to the garden that she had planted with so much care. The flowers that grew there, roses, daisies, sunflowers, were simple but brought a beauty that no professional landscaper had managed to create in his previous gardens. There was something in the way Lourdes cared for each plant, how she talked to them while watering them, that transformed that space into something magical. He thought about his previous life, in the empty penthouse where he spent entire nights, working alone in the endless meetings where he discussed figures that seemed important at the time, but that now sounded completely empty. All that seemed to belong to another person, to a man who had existed but who was no longer real. His phone rang, interrupting the peaceful contemplation. It was Richard, who had become not only a sympathetic partner, but a true friend after witnessing Michael's transformation. In the last 2 years, he himself had begun to rethink his priorities, dedicating more time to family and projects with social impact. "How's the family?" Richard asked, who had adopted the habit of calling weekly to hear the news. "Isabella managed to walk 20 meters without support today," Michael said, the pride evident in his voice. "And Lourdes is planning to expand the vegetable garden in the spring. She wants to plant tomatoes and peppers." Richard laughed fondly. "You know that 3 years ago you would never have called me to tell me about physical therapy exercises and gardening plans? 3 years ago, I didn't know that these were the most important things in the universe. And the hospital project, how are the preparations going?" "Construction starts next month. Isabella has already chosen the color she wants to paint the children's physical therapy room. It's going to be sunflower yellow, as she says." When he hung up the phone, Michael remained in the garden for a few more minutes, listening to the night sounds that had become a familiar symphony. Children playing in the neighboring houses, neighbors talking about fences, soft music coming from some nearby residence. It was an urban symphony, completely different from the golden silence of his old life, and he wouldn't trade a single bar of it for all the ostentation he had left behind. Before going inside, he looked at the windows of the house that had become his true home. In Isabella's room, a nightlight cast soft shadows on the wall, and he could see some of her books scattered on the bed. She had developed a voracious passion for reading. In Lourdes' room, he glimpsed the silhouette of the grandmother reading her Bible before bed, as she did religiously every night since he could remember, murmuring her prayers of gratitude. 3 years ago, he was one of the richest men in the country, but he lived in the most absolute emotional poverty. Now he had found a wealth that no fortune could buy. The deep feeling of belonging to something greater than himself, of having a purpose that transcended material success. When he finally entered the house, he did something that had become a sacred ritual. Before going to his room, he first went to Isabella's room, adjusting the blanket that had slipped and observing for a moment the peace in her sleeping face. Then he went to Lourdes' room, where she had already turned off the light. "Good night, Mama Lourdes," he whispered softly. "Good night, my boy," she replied in a sleepy voice. "Sleep with God." And for the first time in over 40 years, Michael August Mansfield truly slept in peace, knowing that he had found what he had been looking for all his life without knowing, a place where he was loved not for what he possessed, but for who he had chosen to become. The next morning, life would begin again with its simple and extraordinary routines. There would be physical therapy for Isabella, medical appointments, fund meetings, family dinners. There would also be challenges. Lourdes' health would require increasing care. The construction of the hospital would bring complications. Business would always demand attention. But for the first time in decades, Michael would wake up knowing exactly why it was worth getting out of bed. There were two people in the world who depended on him, who loved him unconditionally, who made him feel needed in the purest and truest way possible. The millionaire had become simply a whole man, and he discovered that this was the greatest wealth anyone could ever aspire to. In the end, the story that had begun in a dark alley with a girl in danger had transformed into something much greater. A lesson about how love can heal even the most wounded hearts, about how it's never too late to choose humanity over empty success, about how true family isn't defined by blood, but by the daily choice to care for each other. And in a simple house in a quiet neighborhood, three people, whom fate had separated and reunited, continued to write a love story that no amount of money in the world could buy. A story that proved that sometimes getting completely lost is the only way to truly find yourself. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to receive new stories every day. What would you do in the Millionaire's place? Comment below and share this story with someone special.